The computer-brain interface, in which patients can be hooked up with electrodes to a computer and actually move the cursor with their mind. Those of you who've seen Julian Schnabel's The Diving Bell and the Butterfly will see this sort of primitive scheme of blinking one's eye in order to communicate through when you are completely paralyzed but have locked-in syndrome. So there is now the fact that you and the computer can actually express to the outside world your thoughts. So that is one amazing thing. Another really amazing thing is these research scientists in, I guess it's MIT, and what they were able to do, and I'm going to read you from this text, is create a biodegradable microscopic bridge that alters brain cells to flourish. In their research with mice, neuroscientists were able to restore partial vision in hamsters with severed neural pathways. Although no new neurons grew, this bridge created an environment whereby existing cells could regrow their long branch-like projections called axons. So this is a kind of repurposing of the body with the machine. And Michael, can you talk about your ideas about this, since you've been working with this for a long time?
Again, I'm kind of going to go back to something and talk a little bit about computers and use that as a place to start. One of the things that's always fascinating about computers is that basically it's a switch at the bottom. There are lots of switches put together, but it's essentially a switch. There's a processor on your motherboard, and it basically vibrates up and down, many millions or billions of times over some time increment. And what's interesting about that, and then everything else is built on top of that. Everything is built to perceive it or to measure it, and then to represent information, and to do all these things on top of that. We can do so it's a very simple where we can skin data in different ways, right? So this simple vibration can become a picture of you. It can become the information from the stock market data. It can become, the stock market data can become a symphony. Many people have done this kind of thing. We can constantly exchange and remap the signal processing to the extent that it will represent anything. Now, at the same time, lasers and laser lights and things like that, these represent, I mean, I'm not an expert on laser science, I've just read a couple of articles, but they also represent a different kind of light. A light that would only be possible when you have a certain sort of both philosophical and technical knowledge that you can implement this thing. So we have this interesting thing, that this tool that's in our lives, and you know, people always talk about it as a tool, it's just a tool, so on and so forth. I think of it as more profound than that. I think it's a tool that changes us. I mean, I remember in the early days, I'm not known for my orderly behavior. And so in the early days, I loved computers because I felt like they kind of put me together a little bit. You know, they kind of remembered things for me and did stuff, and I began to rely on them. And then at the same time, I saw that that way of organizing started to seep into the way I thought about problems, right? It's an old saying, you know, to a hammer, everything's a nail. So to a computer, and to what computer does in the ways computers represent data, it will only represent data in that way. And there are things outside. I think I just...
I had a question in regards to neuroplasticity and the idea of like the internet or the computer as a tool. There's a book by Nicholas Carr called The Shallows, How the Internet is Changing Our Brains. And it makes the argument that the rapid access to information on the internet is actually changing our neural pathways and how we think. It's giving us like shorter attention spans, and we're actually thinking in a more shallow but broad way. And I guess my question would be, A, do you think that that's actually true? And B, what does that mean for the future of learning and for art making?
I definitely think it's true. As I said before, our brains are constantly changing, our circuitry's changing. Those dendritic spines I talked about change rapidly. We can measure them. We can measure calcium going in them. We can visualize them. And we know there have been studies that have shown that patients with Alzheimer's disease, and there's some elderly that don't use computers very often, when they start to have the early signs, they train them on computers, teach them how to use the internet, and it's kind of a use it or lose it approach. And it actually is
These studies were done with regard to film and television earlier on, and when people would go to the movie theaters and see the train coming on the screen, they'd run out screaming because they thought that this was real, and certainly television has changed our brains. My little granddaughter, who's 5, has her own iPad. She does multitasking constantly. It's not just one thing, that she does at least 3 things at one time. And when she was 2 and saw the television, she touched it to see if it would move, the same way she would touch a computer game. So there's a whole new generation that is growing up on this stuff.
Culture, like a train out of control. And the interesting thing is that one of the best predictive mechanisms is to go back and look at other moments in time when disruptive technologies came about, and how did people respond to them, and what happened. And of course, one of those was the written text, right? The minute you could write something down instead of having to remember it, what did that do to culture, and what did it do to the human brain? Then there's another one. We actually could mass produce what we wrote down. And what did that do to culture, and what did that do to the human brain? I think that for people that are 50 and above, I mean, I'm gonna make some broad generalizations, right? This is a little more difficult. Our brains are not as plastic, we're not as young, all these kinds of things. 30 and above, it's still complicated and hard, but you gotta use it for your job and you gotta do whatever. 20 and above, you're sort of still in that you're 0 to 20? What?
Panelists, audience, goodbye.